Awesome. All right, we've got a very special guest next here. We got Rahim, who's an Austrian economist, and early into Bitcoin. His title of his talk is Good Money, Bad Money, and the Conquest of America. So come on up, Rahim. Give it up for him.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you. I really appreciate you postponing lunch for a history lesson. Of course, if you can remember the past, you're condemned to repeat it, but also you should only trust the histories you have fabricated yourself. History is about identities, so it's full of identitarian crap. So let me face the trust issue up front. A man giving history lessons, that's called mansplaining these days due to the toxic relations of the past, but it gets even worse, of course. I have a trigger warning for you. I have non-Western heritage, but I'm a raised Westerner, and giving history lessons on Latin America, of course, I can feel the toxicity on my shoulders. So I thought I have to go over the top. I had to do cultural appropriation as well, so I put on the souvenirs I got here in El Salvador and really be over the top. Because, I mean, seriously, I think the way to deal with toxic relationships is to be open about them and to go at the root. And I think I have some surprising insights for you, how at the root of the bad relationships of the past, but also some good relationships, is money. And that's underrated. Of course, one surprising insight, but only if you're of the woke kind, I think, is that the conquest of America started with the Europeans. The colonialism is a typically European phenomenon. No, of course not. There was, most of the boring kind of history you get in school is all about conquest. It's like groups that are superior in technology or numbers, conquering other groups. That's basically the battles and war, a bullshit kind of history you get. So there's nothing unique about that. So there were conquests going on in Latin America before the Europeans. You had very advanced, developed agricultural societies conquering other societies. And they had forms of money, of course, as well. The typical forms of money were corns and beans. So what's the money thing here? It's a fungible, transferable measure of wealth. And corns and beans are not the worst, but a really bad kind of money. Why is it a really bad kind of money? The first obvious reasons, those are existential goods. So if monetary demand goes up and you have increased monetization of things that people need for their survival, that's really bad for you. It's the same thing with real estate nowadays. Most Westerners save in real estate, so real estate is monetized. Everyone needs accommodation, but fewer and fewer are able to afford it. And that's the same thing with existential goods that are monetized. But there is another disadvantage, less advantage of corns and beans as money, and that's little known. Corns and beans are bad money from my point of view and great money from the others. They are not easily concealable. They don't offer privacy. Why? Corns and beans need light. They have stalks growing up announcing visibly to everyone, harvest is ready, about to come. So that's the perfect government money. It's perfectly taxable. It's obvious. You can conceal it. And that's, of course, the reason for the toxic relationships within Latin America before. Those advanced agricultural civilizations, they were not progress from the individualist point of view. They were regress. So for the individual, the quality of life, of course, went down because they had redistributive systems in a very pyramid-like structure of society. The money is ratios, it's sustenance ratios, and you need it, and you got to pay taxes with it, and it's very hard to conceal. So you have this churning machinery, and I think it's no coincidence that the pyramid is also the most conspicuous building in the Egyptian society, which had a very similar pyramidal structured society of centralized, concentrated money used as handouts to keep the population in check and obedient. Now, here in El Salvador, we have the Mayas. The worst are the Incas. There's completely totalitarian socialist society. The Mayas were a bit better. They had another form of money more widely used, not more widely used than corn beans, but more widely used than in other societies. That's cacao. Cacao beans, transferable, fungible, measures of wealth, much better than corns and beans. They are not necessities, they are luxury goods. So you have kind of luxury consumption. The problem with luxury goods as money is you get most of the value if you're an insider in society, if you're part of the elite, if you're part of the ceremonies that happen. So it's a bit of a flattened pyramid. You have an elite on top that's doing the cacao consumption, but it's still a pyramidal structure, a bit better. But it really got worse, of course, when the Spaniards came and took over these pyramidal societies with a much smaller elite of foreigners extracting all the corns, beans, cacao, and then later on, of course, silver, gold, coffee, and so on, all the cash crops that they extracted from here. But the more interesting thing is not that kind of pyramidal structure, is how the Spaniards were then able, with these few men, to be superior in technology, and that's not due to their extractive capacities. It's due to the very different development of European societies. High levels of violence, of course, but a kind of more decentralized society where you have much more competition between political structures. So Europe was unique already quite early in being a much more decentralized society, and it's unique for having a monetary infrastructure that was for large parts vastly superior than in other parts of the world. So how did the Spaniards get the know-how and the wealth to be able to discover new continents? And that's not out of Spain itself. Of course, Spain early on, or the region that is now Spain, had very wealthy cities, and they were merchant nodes within the merchant networks, merchant cities, unfortunately taken over by the successful conquest of Spain by the Spanish government. After kicking out the Muslims, they really perfectionized this kind of concentration of wealth and military power for conquest. So unfortunately, they were successful in there. But of course, in order to concentrate something, wealth has to be there first. And innovation, technology has to be there first for you in order to be able to control it and concentrate it. So Columbus, for example, who was the first one to, like as a European, discover the shores of El Salvador, he was from Genoa, a northern Italian. There's no way he would have gone to the Spanish court if they offered him a kind of ratio money, like food. Oh, we are going to feed you really well on tortillas and pupusas in our court. They wouldn't have moved him or pushed him to come there. Even a kind of luxury money wouldn't have made it, like, oh, you'll be able to enjoy our ceremonial luxurious status goods at the court. That's not enough. What they needed, and what's crucial about a competitive patronage that was significant for the technological and cultural development of Europe, is trustless, neutral money. Something that for a foreigner makes sense, someone who's an outsider to your society, and still it's something that's fungible, transferable, but it's trustless, and it's not dependent on the context of the court or society you're entering. So this northern Italian merchant, he came already from the richest culture in Europe. So the northern Italian cities were the first. Why were they first? They had a really significant discovery, a social technology that was only very later on rediscovered by a bunch of weirdos. And that principle is don't trust, verify. So that's the major insight of northern Italian cities, don't trust, verify. It led to the development of double entry bookkeeping, and it led to a new monetary standard. They realized that the best standard is a thing that you can verify independently out of the objective characteristics of the monetary protocol itself. Not some outside trusts like guarantee, stamp, and so on. So the florin, which was the most important standard, so coming from florins, was not actually a coin. It's just a definition. It's just a definition. It's a definition of a weight and purity of a precious metal. And then you can like check for all the coins and figure out how much they are expressed in that standard, which I think is a crucial discovery because it makes you now independent and from any kind of political imposition or societal convention even. So that I think was a bit behind the Italian Renaissance, this kind of competitive patronage happening there already in culture. decentralized structures, having a sound monetary protocol for competitive patronage, and that's the same with the Spanish court then. As with most courts in Europe, they were in competition with others in patronage. So they tried to get the brightest people come to their courts, their places, and they had to offer them something in return, and that was this kind of neutral, trustless money. Of course, the Spaniards then, unfortunately, they were successful conquerors, first of Spain and then of large parts of the world, and they had a very extractive relationship. And what they did is this way, with this kind of thinking and this top-down thinking, they destroyed their own monetary protocol. They turned silver into a shit coin. How did that happen? They realized, okay, we can do some pre-mining in a way. We'll pump it in Latin America and we'll dump it in Europe. And by doing so, of course, they had some short-term leverage here, but in the long term, they destroyed the monetary protocol. And that, of course, with the concentration and the lack of freedom, the lack of innovation comes from it, led to the early stagnation of the Spanish Empire, basically a downfall of the Spanish Empire. One of the richest leading places of Europe fell back and still hasn't really recovered. So I'd say that kind of extractive colonialism was bad for Latin America, but it was even worse for Spain because it's not a sustainable business model. It's just extracting. It's called strip mining. And that was discovered fairly early on during the second, much less known conquest of America. This reference comes from Simon Bolivar. He said, the real conquest of America, the real discovery of America was done by someone else, someone very unlikely, a German guy, which is very odd. It's a German guy. He's much better known in Latin America than in Germany these days. That was Alexander von Humboldt. He was a Renaissance man, not of the Italian Renaissance, of the much later German Renaissance in the 18th century. And his German Renaissance had the same structure behind it, competitive patronage between very small jurisdictions. You had hundreds of principalities competing within the German countries. So it's a highly decentralized structure. And this competitive patronage within the smallest and least powerful principality led to them realizing, okay, we're not going to be a big military power. We're not going to conquer the world and extract its resources. We have to be different. So unfortunately, the prince died early. His wife took over, and she got an interest in culture, and it was Weimar. And she started like doing competitive patronage for culture in a small principality and attracted the German Shakespeare, Goethe. It was more of her son. Her son turned out to be a really cool guy. If Weimar had a beach, I think he'd be a surfer dude. He was like a really fun guy to hang out with. What he did was like skinny dipping because you don't have like the sea beaches. He went nudist swimming in the lakes. Everyone thought he was crazy. He was just having a good time. He was a free thinker, interested in new ideas, so he attracted Goethe. Goethe became his best friend. And also Alexander von Humboldt met Goethe in Weimar, and his brother Wilhelm von Humboldt was one of the closest friends of Goethe, and they're part of that patronage. And Alexander von Humboldt is an impressive genius. What he did, he really discovered the Americas, not only for the Europeans, putting it on the map, literally. He put it on the maps, he drew the maps. He discovered it for the people within Latin America. That's why he's still known and cherished here. He, through the eyes of the foreigners, showing an interest and trying to understand things, helped the local population discover the beauty of their places and the richness of their places. He was the first volcano scientist in El Salvador, the first one to figure out what's behind it, to figure out how intricate these ecological systems are. He was the first environmentalist. He criticized the Spaniards for deforestation. Now, the term sustainability comes from German forestry economics, and he realized this kind of deforestation, of course, is like strip mining. It's not sustainable. You go like a plow, you go through a country and you destroy it. and then it's off for you, then there's nothing else you can take people. That's what happened, but there's not much more value to extract. So there were crucial insights by these later discoveries of Central America. But what's behind it? It's the leisure through competitive patronage and monetary means available, and it's the genius that is then allowed to be productive through the leisure. Leisure means you don't have to work for your survival every day. But that's not enough to go to El Salvador in the 18th century. I mean, still as a German coming here, or Austrian in my case, that's a long voyage. Takes a lot of leisure to come here. But in the 18th century, that's impossible. So what made it possible for one guy, Alexander von Humboldt, to go to El Salvador in the 18th century is he was a rich guy. He inherited, but he didn't inherit just full estates, which was typical. If you're rich in the past, you inherit full estates. And his family, of course, were low nobility. They had full estates. But due to the access to the merchant networks, in particular the Hanse structures and so on, they could monetize their productivity. So he inherited 100,000 thalers, cash, really significant cash from his mother. So what are thalers? Thalers are from Joachimsthal. That's a valley in Bohemia, one of the most important mines of the time. It's precious metal mining. And of course, after all that Spanish shitcoinery, there was a rebalancing over time because still you have to extract it out of the ground. It's costly. So he had, with that inheritance, of course, he could compete with kings, having his own expedition and paying for his own expedition without needing to plunder anyone before. Goethe, interestingly, had an important role for El Salvador to play. Through those contacts and his interest for the New World, he got into coffee. He really liked coffee, but he was a scientific mind. He was curious. So he got a good friend of his, a famous chemist at the time, famous, not known anymore, I think, Friedrich Runge. He got him to figure out how does it work, how does coffee work. So Runge spent a few months trying to isolate the components, the alkaloid, and he discovered caffeine. And he found out, due to being pushed by Goethe, how coffee works. And that's really important. Why is it important? Because if you don't know how it works, either it's like a wonder drug, you overhype it, or you're afraid. And that's the most likely consequence. You're afraid of something you don't understand. You want to outlaw it. You want to have prohibition. But figuring out it's a relatively harmless constituent and how it works in the body and so on, that led the way for coffee becoming this export good, this important export good. And it also explains why in the early 19th century and late 18th century, mostly early 19th century, the most important coffee buyers as merchants, as wholesale merchants, were Germans, which is surprising by now. So they were really dominant. And what the Germans did different from the Spanish before is they settled down, they married locally, they set up businesses. There was still some toxicity, and I'll talk about that soon. But it was much better than the Spanish kind of extraction, not because Germans are any better, it's just the luck there was no German Empire at the time. It would be much worse, of course, if there already was a German Empire being dominant and doing all the coffee thing, and the Germans had proven afterwards that they are just as capable of extractive colonialism as the others. But this linkage of the continents, really, like new connectivity, that led to a lot of fostering. And thankfully, the Spanish Empire had fallen down. The British took over, and that is behind the third conquest of the Americas. Usually it's called the second one because most people don't know that the real second one is the third one. And that's the export boom starting from 1850 to 1930. There was really a huge export boom in the cash crops, in particular coffee in this region, and it's sometimes referred to as a new conquest of America. It led to a lot of investment. At the time, the British said, or some government authorities said, okay, any young guy who is willing to go, speaks a bit of Spanish, and has $5,000 cash current value with him, he'll be able to make it. It's a place of opportunity. It's a place for pioneers who take the risk. And it's due to these connections happening. Unfortunately, there was still a lot of toxicity. And where does the toxicity come from? And I give you an example from one major company, the most important company operating, the South Sea Company. They had commerce as one of their pillars, but it was only one, and they had two other more important industries they were in. Commerce was based on the sound monetary infrastructure of the time with all its problems, but still it's a kind of merchant-based monetary protocol, I'd say. But there were two other forms of money, and they were much worse. The first most important business of the South Sea Company is dealing in the worst form of money ever invented. Was the worst form of money as a fungible, transferable measure of wealth ever invented: human beings, slaves. So what they did, like pragmatic business-like, they went for the regulated business with the highest margins. They got a license, they were regulated, licensed, they agreed to an 18% tax, fabulous, just give the king his share, and they specialized in the provision of slaves. So they would do the logistics and dealing in slaves. And it's, of course, a lot of toxicity, past toxicity. Obviously, it's the worst kind of thing you can do. And the worst kind of thing you can imagine. It's based on inferior monetary protocols. The second, a bit better form of money, but in between slavery and commodity money, fiat money. The British invented the modern form of fiat money. What is it? Monetized government debt. So the second most important business model of the South Sea Company was speculating in British government debt. And that, of course, should tell you where a bit more of the toxicity comes from. And it's the kind of toxicity that has survived to the present, because it's the kind of business model that was taken over then when the British Empire fell down due to too much extraction, too little sustainable value built up, being too enticed by better business opportunities to the dealing in the bad forms of money and the destruction of trust that goes with it. It's the Americans that, of course, took the stage on the main form of the kind of dollar diplomacy of the Americans. And how they did it in El Salvador is, of course, you give a debt and you collateralize it with export duties, with taxation. So, of course, that's like the slavery part of government bonds. Their collateral is the capacity to extract value out of the population in the long term. That's the only collateral they have. It makes sense as a collateral from a pragmatic point of view. As they say, there are only two things that are certain: death and taxes. So that's why it's such a successful asset class. And the British are really like first in discovering it. But what's the problem with that? Of course, it leads to toxicity, one-sidedness, and in El Salvador in particular, it gave leverage to the highly unequal situation on the ground. Why was it already highly unequal? Planting the most important cash crop to the connection to the rest of the world, in particular Europe and then the US. Coffee, it takes 5 to 7 years of attentive culture to have coffee ripening. So if you don't have savings, it's impossible to become a coffee entrepreneur, coffee farmer. It takes capital up front. That, of course, is already kind of dynamic inequality. I think that's fine. I think it's great that British and Germans went here and invested money on their own risk. But that already existing inequality, of course, was made much worse. If you're already good in producing coffee, of course you have a higher productivity on the land. You're eager to buy up more land. What do you pay the land in you buy? If you pay in a currency that has a decreasing purchasing power and you get an asset that has an increasing purchasing power, of course, in the long run, that leads to the ever higher concentrations we have seen all around the world happening. But something even worse happened here, and another discovery of shitcoinery happened in El Salvador. They were very early pioneers, some coffee farms, because they were employing people that came from a subsistence economy, that didn't use a monetary protocol before, that were unbanked or even uncashed before. They decided to pay them with tokens. They called them fincha, the original coffee shitcoin. The fincha, that's the name of it. I hope no one comes up with a new project of like put coffee on the blockchain and call it fincha. So what's the problem with that? Of course, I mean, as a token you can only use in a company store to get your ratios of corns and beans. There's no way to build up capital yourself. There's no way to ever be investing yourself while all the land, all the productive capacity gets bought up by the people already having the capital and the cash. So really bad incentives, really distortion. I think that explains a lot of the toxicity. I'm very positively surprised how little you feel it here still. I mean, with all the craziness in the past and all the violence, how positive it's still here. And I think the greatest thing about El Salvador is deciding to opening up. Because the worst thing you can do, and that's anti-colonialism, that's what it's mainly about, going from the toxicity of the past and concluding, oh, you've been burned by foreigners in the past. You start hating foreigners, you start hating foreign investment, you start hating connections to global markets, and you have all these claptrap of anti-globalist, anti-neoliberal, which has, of course, a true core of true real experience. Real toxicity was there. We can explain it, how it happened, where it comes from. But it's very hard because money is the most difficult, most complex subject there is. So it takes a long time, like figuring out the roots of your toxic relationships of the past and really pinpointing it to. That's why we have the least successful stories in Latin America, of Venezuela, of Haiti, of Cuba, going the anti-colonialist way and just shutting up and being now an autarky, and having less productivity and less investment and no visitors because you were so bad in the past. So we don't take dollars, we only take Chinese money now. And it's the same kind of pyramid structure, of course, usually worse, much worse than the dollar diplomacy of the past. So you see, it can always get worse in a certain sense. I think that's a typical polarization that we have in the laws of politics, and I think it's important to be open about that. Like, you have something that's bad in the past, but it has, of course, some positive elements always. I think in the long run, it was positive that Europeans, of course not discovered, but rediscovered connections to other continents that allowed connections between people. It took a long time to work, because people didn't realize how important the monetary protocol is for that cooperation to be a win-win cooperation. So that's what makes me a bit optimistic, I'd say. But only if you realize that the success story of El Salvador is not Westerners coming here because they can pay in Bitcoin, that it's now you get money. It's you look behind it. What makes it possible that people come from so far away to a country that was not on their maps before, and they're rediscovering it? Of course, it's the kind of leisure and wealth Bitcoin potentially provides to you, that you are able not to just be in a job, because asking your boss to go to El Salvador usually is difficult. Go do a work trip and discovering it. Maybe if you're in mining or coffee or something, usually it's not. So have the kind of leisure and interest and savings that make that possible to come here. So El Salvador really, I think, needed Bitcoin. It needs Bitcoin. It needs this leisure, but it will only be a success story if it can work as a monetary protocol for El Salvadorians, not just as a payment feature, but allowing them to be first in history, reinvesting themselves, building up capital themselves, taking a part in the productivity that comes possible due to connections, due to exchange, due to more people having it on the map. And that's the unique opportunity we shouldn't fuck up, excuse me, my French, while here. But still, there's a huge potential in making use of that, and we can learn a lot from history how huge that potential is. Thanks a lot for postponing lunch. Thank you.